Hi Year 12, this is a video about religious experiences and essays relating to religious experiences. I'm going to look at this essay. William James fails in his attempt to show that religious experiences are important. Discuss. So yeah, William James is the only scholar who it's possible you could get a direct question about, a question that mentions him and is directly about his theories. And there's a complication with William James. The thing that makes him tricky to write essays about is that it's complex what William James is actually arguing for, because he says a lot that's of interest about religious experiences, but he falls short of arguing that religious experiences directly prove the existence of God, or that we can directly say that religious experiences come from God. So I'm going to talk about something. There's various ways you could answer this essay, but I'm going to talk about something you could do, that you should do in the introduction, which I think helps to outline how you plan the rest of the essay. So I'm going to go through a structure that I might use. At the end, I might say a few things about some other ways you could structure this this essay. If you're not doing this essay, I still think it would be good if you watched the video and made notes on the structure, because it would be helpful. Okay. Most of these videos, the other videos, I haven't really done anything about introductions, but this is important, I think, because if you look at the question, William James fails in his attempt to show that religious experiences are important. You need to unpack that in your introduction. So this would be in your D of your disc, your definition. So what do we mean by important? And I think in William James's case, we can say that we can identify two ways in which a religious experience could be defined as important. Firstly, they're important to the people who have them. Is this what we mean by important? So that's one way to interpret it, to say they're important to the people who have them. In other words, they are profound and life-changing events for them. Secondly is, are they important as proof of the existence of God? Now, obviously the first of those, if William James wanted to show the first of those, that they're important to the people who have them, that's easier to show. The second one is harder to show, but it's up to you really, and you'd have to state out your case when you talk about this, which one you take the essay to be meaning, or in other words, which one you think really shows that they're important. Because, okay, you could take the line of, obviously they'd be important if they prove the existence of God, but you could say even if they don't prove the existence of God, they're still important if the people who have them value them. However, on another perspective could be put like this, to say if they don't, they would be very important if they prove the existence of God, but if they don't prove the existence of God, and in fact if they can be proved to come from somewhere else other than from God, then they should not be important to the people who have them. Then maybe they are, but they shouldn't be. So we could say that maybe William James has proved that they're important to the people that have them, but the evidence suggests, or the philosophical argument suggests, that they shouldn't be important, because these people are, what these people think of as a life-changing experience is just a kind of hallucination, or the result of something happening to the temporal lobes of their brain. So that's an interesting way to argue. So I think quite an interesting way of arguing is to say, yes, these events are life-changing, but if they're not from God, they shouldn't be life-changing. We should not see them as important. They're just things that happen to these people at kind of at random, which they've interpreted as life-changing events. So let's go into our perils. So yeah, I haven't written a lot on the slides here. You'll just have to go by what I say. So pragmatism, that's the first place I'd come in. So you want to start by talking about what William James argues, and obviously the argument that William James makes for the importance of religious experiences, or the authenticity of religious experiences, is their practical effects, how they affect people's lives. So we're talking about going from a sick soul to being a soul with a zest for life and a moral purpose and a sense of enthusiasm for life, and also a reduced sense of self-centeredness, all that kind of stuff. Now, it's worth saying that for William James, that's what defines an authentic religious experience. So when he's talking about religious experiences, he's only really talking about experiences that involve that kind of change. So that's something to say. He's only really saying that those are of importance. And what's he saying? Well, these are authentic religious experiences. That means they are unlikely to be fake. They must be real, because they had a really lasting effect on people's lives. However, obviously, we've got to go from there to say that this on its own doesn't seem to prove, the criticism will be, doesn't seem to prove that they come from God. So he might have, Bertrand Russell would say a fictional story can prove a fictional story can change someone's life. That doesn't make the story true. So it probably when you come to evaluate this peril, you've got pragmatism proves that they're important. Bertrand Russell's argument would suggest, but just because they're important to the person doesn't prove they come from God. And then your evaluation, you want to turn it back to what you talked about in your introduction and say, well, okay, William James seems to have proved that lots of religious experiences are important to the people who have them. However, Bertrand Russell shows that doesn't necessarily prove they come from God. And so for me, if I was answering that, I would say, well, what makes them important for me is if they are really evidence of God, not just the fact that they influence people's lives. So I would say William James doesn't prove overall that they're important. What he proves is that they change people's lives and therefore they're not fake. What we really need to explore is whether they really come from God. And here I would mention this whole thing about a what's the word he uses? Something hypothesis. A reasonable hypothesis. Sorry, I completely forgot. So there I talk about William James's idea of a reasonable hypothesis to say, well, okay, William James says that religious experiences change people's lives. To me, that's not enough to make them important, because if they change their lives when they don't come from God, then they're just changing their lives based on an illusion. Bertrand Russell shows that just because they change lives, they might not come from God, because they could be fictional. And William James admits this, but he says that it is a reasonable hypothesis. So he's almost basically, if my interpretation of important is they show the existence of God, then he's basically saying he's showing that they might be important. There's a reasonable hypothesis that they are the evidence for the existence of God is a reasonable hypothesis. I hope that makes sense. Do send me a message or put comments below this on the Teams page if you're not sure what I'm talking about here. Okay, so then I'll go to this one. Psychological explanation suggests they're not important. So this is where I'm going to say, actually, James, here's a reason to say James is wrong, or not James is wrong, or at least that they don't come from God. So in other words, that James is wrong about them being a reasonable hypothesis. So psychological explanations could say, Freud has proved without a doubt that religious experiences come from the mind. They're nothing to do with God. Therefore, it's not a reasonable hypothesis to say they come from God. Therefore, they're not important. So you want to go into Freud and an Oedipus complex and how that was resolved in early childhood, and then talk about the fear of death and other natural forces, and the way in which people construct a father figure, and how that can lead to hallucinatory psychosis, and therefore to having a religious experience. So all of that would indicate that even if they change people's lives, it's just a complete illusion. There's no reality to them. So their importance is an illusory importance, and therefore they're not important at all. In your criticisms, the main criticism we give of Freud is the lack of evidence. He bases his theories of the Oedipus complex on a small number of cases. His theories about religious experience are just built up upon his other theories about the mind, so there's no direct evidence he uses for them. And you might want to bring back to James's pragmatism here, because if you think about it, James is if religious experiences are the product of an illusion and a kind of symptom of mental illness, we might not expect them to have great results in people's lives. If they're just complete nonsense that come from a deluded mind, then we wouldn't expect them to turn their lives around. But if there is a God and they come from God, then in line with Christian teachings, we would expect them to make people's lives better. After all, you could use this: the fruit of the Spirit is patience, kindness, So in a way, I think there's two kind of criticisms. One, Freud's got no proof, but also William James's explanation, his hypothesis that they come from God, seems more reasonable, because if they came from God, we'd expect people's lives to change for the better. Whereas if they were just a delusion, it would be strange if they made people's life better. So therefore, I would kind of, how you evaluated this peril would be complicated, but it would be up to you. But I might say, well, two things. One, Freud certainly hasn't disproven the idea that they come from God. He has suggested an alternative idea that they might come from somewhere else, psychology, but his lack of evidence means he can't prove that. Secondly, the whole thing about the pragmatic argument and the idea that, well, actually these experiences tend to have a really positive influence on people gives a bit more weight to William James's theory that they come from God. So I would say Freud certainly hasn't disproved the idea that religious experiences coming from God are a reasonable hypothesis. Secondly, physiological experiences, yes, they're not important. I don't know why I've put that. Physiological evidence or physiological theory. So here I'm talking about temporal lobe epilepsy, I'm talking about Michael Persinger. So here it's the same as Freud, really, in terms of the structure of the argument. You're just saying, actually, religious experiences come from here, from the brain, from the temporal lobes. They don't come from God. Therefore, they're not important because they're just illusions caused by the brain. They might be important to the people that have them, but that doesn't really make them important. These people are just being fooled by a trick of their brain. So you could talk about temporal lobe epilepsy, go into Michael Persinger's God helmet and the experiments, and then how you criticize it. Well, criticism would be fairly straightforward. You could talk about, it mirrors the criticisms you give in the last peril. You could talk about can it be that everyone who has experiences is suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy? It seems unlikely. Can it be that everyone is experiencing some kind of stimulations of the temporal lobe of the brain? Well, that seems unlikely too. You could also talk about the fact that the evidence from Persinger has been challenged by attempts to reproduce his experiments in Sweden. But also, again, you can talk about the pragmatism, because, again, if it's just some kind of illusion coming from your brain, if your brain is just being triggered in this way, then it seems surprising that people's lives are transformed in this amazing way by religious experiences. But if it's true that people's lives are transformed by religious experiences, it fits very easily into the idea of it coming from God, because that's what you'd expect. So again, my evaluation would be here is, again, this opens up a different explanation. So it definitely shows that we cannot 100% say religious experiences come from God. However, it doesn't make the idea that it doesn't prove that the hypothesis that religious experiences come from God is not a reasonable hypothesis. James is still correct about this. And that's where I'd kind of round the whole thing up. So in my conclusion, I'd probably say something like, James has proved that religious experiences are often very important to the people that have them. However, to me, this doesn't make religious experiences important, because it could be that these people have just been fooled by some trick of their psychology or the physics of their brain, the biology of their brain, to think they've had a life-changing experience. What makes it important is, are these real evidence for the existence of God? And from what we've seen, it remains a reasonable hypothesis that they could be evidence of the existence of God, but it can't be proven. So what would my conclusion be? Well, I think William James has shown that it's a reasonable hypothesis that religious experiences are important, but he's not shown that it's definite that they're important. Hope that makes sense. I'd say I've gone through that quite quickly, and I'm kind of thinking out loud quite a lot here. So do let me know if you want to do this essay, if you're finding it tough. But I think it's really important to get that distinction between what do we mean by important, because you might want to go down a completely different line of argument. You might want to use my same perils, but just say, actually, I think that the evidence that religious experiences are either caused by psychology or caused by the temporal lobes of the brain is strong, and therefore William James has not proved that. So it's not a reasonable hypothesis that these experiences come from God. But then you might want to say, but still, I still think these religious experiences are important because they're important to the people that have them. Even if they're not from God, they're important in people's lives. So it all depends, your conclusion, not just on what you think of the different evidence and arguments, but how you define important, what it means for a religious experience to be important. There are some other ways you could answer this question. You could go down the route of looking at, you could look at whether the sorts of experiences that William James is talking about are just too vague to define as experiences of God, because all, you know, a bit like Rudolf Otto, he's talking about these ineffable experiences that can't be put into words, and you know, there's a sense of being surrendering to another power and so on and so on. But if we go to GCA Gaskell's idea of, well, there are non-religious numinous experiences, perhaps we can just say, well, these are just experiences that people have generally in life, and some people are interpreting them in a religious way. So then you would say, well, maybe they're important because these kind of mystical or numinous experiences seem to be very important to people, but they're not important if you were looking for evidence of God, because atheists can have these experiences and interpret them in an atheistic way. That brings us back to some of the arguments I was looking at in the video on mystical experiences. Hope that helps. Yeah, it's difficult with James because you've got to kind of negotiate the fact that he's not directly trying to prove the existence of God, and you've got to acknowledge that he doesn't say religious experiences prove the existence of God. He just says that God is a reasonable hypothesis to explain religious experiences. Okay, thanks, bye.